Now that we've covered some of the mechanics of the course, we can actually do some biology. Now, biology is the study of life. Biologists try to investigate life at various different scales or levels. What do I mean by that? Well, biologists can study the function of a whole individual. In the case of human biology, we might be interested in studying the function of one human body. In this picture, you can see two human bodies. These are two famous biologists, Jim Watson on the left and Francis Crick on the right. They were the discoverers of the structure of DNA back in the 1950s, and we're going to talk during the course over the next week or so why this discovery was significant and why we should care about it. But we might be studying the function of their bodies, or we might zoom in and study functions of portions of their bodies. So for example, we might want to study organs within the body or organ systems. You're looking here at a heart, a diagram of a heart. It works as part of a system with all the blood vessels to move blood around the body for reasons that we'll talk about when we get to the cardiovascular system later in the course. We might want to zoom in even more and study components of this heart. Maybe we want to understand how the individual cells of the heart work. And this video here shows heart cells growing in a petri dish, and you can see they're all moving because these cells are able to contract. That produces the contractions of the heart. So we might study at this level the multiple cells working together. That's called a tissue. So we can study the organ, the entire heart. We can study tissues. These are collections of cells within organs. Maybe we want to study cells on their own. Well, here's a diagram of a typical animal cell, and we'll talk about the structure of this typical cell pretty soon. Maybe we want to study individual components of this single cell. So for example, maybe we want to study the nucleus. Well, the nucleus of this cell contains the DNA. The DNA is the genetic instructions for making the cell and for making our body. We'll talk about that quite a bit more later on. Well, so let's zoom in on the molecules of DNA inside the nucleus, inside this cell. Here's a molecule of DNA. This is the structure that Watson and Crick discovered or first described in the 1950s. It's basically a ladder that's coiled. Sometimes it's referred to as the double helix. It's a little hard to see here if it's not animated and spinning around, but essentially you're looking at the red and orange being the sides of the ladder, and then the blue and gray being the rungs of the ladder. Well, let's zoom in even more. Let's look at one component of this ladder of DNA. So here are the molecules that made up that side of the ladder, and here's part of one of those rungs. And this is a molecule of adenosine. DNA is made of three types of molecules. You might have seen them as A, T, C, and G. It's the four letters that make up DNA. Well, this is the molecule that makes up one of those letters in our genetic code. It's the letter A, adenosine. Well, each of these little balls here is an atom, and the sticks connecting the balls are the bonds that hold these atoms together. So this concept of atoms and bonds we'll get to soon. But for now, I just want you to see that this molecule of adenosine is made up of individual atoms. And we can zoom in on one of those atoms, or on an atom. This is a caricature of an atom showing the three components within the atom. So we can break an atom down into protons and neutrons, and they're found in the center or nucleus of the atom. And then there are electrons, which in this diagram are depicted as these little balls zooming around or orbiting around the nucleus. This isn't the way atoms really exist, but this is sort of an iconic view of that structure. This is a little more of what an atom is like. This is an atom of helium, and in the very center, quite small compared to the total size of the atom, in the very center are the protons and neutrons. And then the electrons aren't little balls zipping about, they become this sort of cloud. Electrons have the ability to exist in multiple places at the same time, which is sort of a bizarre concept, more of a physics concept than a biology concept. As a biologist, this is about as far as we're going to zoom in, and really our interest is going to be in these electrons, because the electrons on the outside of the atom determine how two atoms interact with each other. We'll talk about that in our next video. Physicists are interested in what's inside the electrons or inside the protons and neutrons, but as a biologist, we don't really need to be too concerned about that. So we've gone from the level of the individual all the way down to the atom, and a bunch of different scales in between: individual, organ systems, organ, cells, cells combine to form tissues. You can break the cell down into its components, finally get down to the molecules, and then down to the atoms. Those are the scales we're going to be dealing with in our class this summer, but biologists often like to go to higher scales. So as humans, we're one of millions of species on the planet, and this is a depiction of the tree of life from a website called the Tree of Life Web Project, which we'll look at soon. And it shows that animals make up a good-sized branch, or a good portion of this tree of life. And here we are close to some of our close evolutionary relatives, other vertebrates like frogs, but here are other animals, insects, and worms. And we have other types of life like fungi, mushrooms, or plants, or protists. Protists are single-celled organisms, or bacteria, another single-celled organism, but a different type of single-celled organism. So we'll talk about the differences between these different forms of life in our next video. But for really the rest of the course, we're going to be focusing on us, because this is a course in human biology. But I just wanted to point out that biologists are interested in how these species evolve, how they interact with each other, the ecology of these species. And at the largest scale, biologists are interested in the interactions that occur across the entire planet, across the entire globe. And of course, some people hypothesize that there's life on other planets. There may have been life on Mars. Some think there may still be life on Mars, things similar to the bacteria we find here on Earth, and we're investigating those. Our focus this semester is going to be on humans and those different scales of study within the human, and we'll be starting with chemistry, some of the smaller scales, in our next video.